We don't pay construction workers to think, especially not ones like you. His voice was smug. White shirt, clean clipboard. The room of engineers laughed, some nervously, some eagerly. At the back, a black man in a stained uniform stood silent. No degree. No defense. Just a quiet dignity. But when he reached into his pocket, and sent a short message from a dusty old Nokia phone, no one realized he had just fired the very man who mocked him. Because the laborer they laughed at for being black and unqualified was the CEO. But that was only the beginning. Stay with us, because what happens next will shake the entire company and expose the cracks not just in concrete, but in character. The blistering sun beat down over the vast Houston construction site where Ironcrest Infrastructure Group was erecting one of its most ambitious highway overpass expansions. Dust swirled in the thick summer air, mixing with the low hum of bulldozers and the metallic clang of rebar. A makeshift meeting trailer stood in the center of it all, packed with engineers, project leads, and foremen who had just been summoned for an unscheduled site review. Inside the trailer, the tension was already thick as a slab of concrete. Folding chairs were misaligned, clipboards stacked in corners, and a large rollout blueprint sat half open on the meeting table, fluttering slightly under the AC vent. At the front, Kenneth Ryland, Ironcrest's lead structural engineer, stood tall and assertive in a crisp white shirt and perfectly pressed khakis. His demeanor was that of someone used to giving orders and having them followed without question. Seated toward the back, almost blending in with the other field workers in his dusty blue coveralls and steel-toed boots, was a 42-year-old African-American man named Nate Brooks. His boots were worn, his hands calloused, and his name tag simply read, Foreman, Crew B. As the chatter in the trailer died down, Ryland's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Can you be quiet and let the professionals speak?" The words sliced through the room like a buzzsaw hitting a steel plate. Heads turned. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was surgical. Then, louder, and dripping with condescension. "We don't pay construction workers to think. We pay them to follow orders." Every pair of eyes shifted to Nate Brooks. He didn't respond right away. His jaw was set, throat tight, not out of fear, but from the pressure of holding back a deep, familiar anger. The kind that bubbles just beneath the surface after a lifetime of being told you're less than. His fingers lightly touched the edge of the blueprint, but his gaze never wavered. Nate had raised a concern moments earlier. A technical one. The foundation at the northeast end of the site was misaligned with the natural slope of the terrain. Without proper adjustment or reinforcement, it would inevitably cause differential settling, possibly as much as 1.5 inches, which could destabilize the supporting pillars over time. He had said it calmly. Clearly. Respectfully. "With all due respect, sir," Nate had started. "The terrain has a 5-degree slope. If we don't reinforce the northeast foundation with additional rebar and extend the footing, we're looking at uneven stress loads and eventual surface cracking." But Ryland had laughed loud, theatrical. He turned to the group of engineers behind him, most of them young, white, and either too new or too wary to challenge him. "Did y'all hear that? Our cement guy's now a structural analyst," he said, smirking. "Maybe I should hand him my degree from MIT. Looks like we've got a genius in the gravel pit." A few forced chuckles followed. The kind of laughter people use to stay safe, not because they found anything remotely funny. Nate didn't laugh. He didn't bow his head or fidget. Instead, he simply folded the blueprint back into its original roll with quiet precision. And that, more than anything, seemed to agitate Ryland. "This right here," Ryland barked, pacing toward him, "is why we have tiers of management. People like me make decisions. People like you follow them." He pointed to his chest with the tip of his laser pointer like a lecturer in front of a dim class. The workers along the back wall looked down at their boots. A few engineers exchanged tight-lipped glances. Patrick Rowe, Ironcrest's senior design consultant, shifted uncomfortably beside the printer. He wasn't laughing. Nate looked up again. Still silent. Ryland stepped closer, his voice rising as he sensed he was losing the room. We can't just have people in hard hats deciding how we build infrastructure. What's next? You gonna run a stress test on a bridge using duct tape? No one spoke. The room filled with a different kind of quiet. The kind that only happens when everyone is waiting to see if something breaks. Nate leaned back slightly and spoke, low but clear. I only spoke up to prevent this from becoming a bigger issue. That's all. Ryland clapped mockingly. Well, thank you, Engineer Brooks, for your insight. Now, back to reality. We're behind schedule. And we're not holding up progress over someone's feelings. The words were meant to humiliate, to shove Nate's voice back into the shadows. And to everyone else, it seemed like it worked. But Nate wasn't defeated. He reached into the side pocket of his coveralls and pulled out an old Nokia 3310 phone, dusty, scratched, but still fully functional. A relic in a world of iPhones and smartwatches. He typed exactly 11 characters. ZB2S14, call back. Then he pressed send. No one noticed. No one realized what had just happened. Outside, the Texas sun blazed over rebar cages and half-poured concrete. Inside the trailer, Ryland continued to drone on about optimization models and permitting schedules as if nothing had happened. But a shift had begun, subtle, like a tremor before an earthquake. Nate stayed silent. But the balance of power at the Ironcrest project site had just quietly tilted. The last laugh Ryland made, one final, arrogant chuckle, echoed hollowly through the trailer. It bounced off steel walls and concrete charts. And Nate, sitting there in his stained jacket, one hand still resting on the edge of the blueprint, wasn't looking at Ryland anymore. He was looking past him at the flawed foundation outside. The one no one else was seeing. Yet. The temperature outside crept over 97 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sticky Houston humidity clung to every exposed surface of the job site. The hum of jackhammers and diesel engines faded into the background as Nate Brooks, still seated, still silent, slipped his Nokia phone back into his pocket. The 11-character message he sent had already traveled across a private relay, far removed from the company's monitored systems. Across the trailer, Kenneth Ryland was still talking. His laser pointer flicked across the projector screen, now showing a spreadsheet packed with numbers no one could focus on anymore. A few engineers pretended to take notes. Others simply nodded without comprehension. Ryland was in his element, pacing confidently like a TED Talk speaker who believed every word coming out of his mouth was divine truth. But his assistant, Leo Benton, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His eyes had caught a glimpse of Nate's phone. Not the brand or the message, but the manner, calm, calculated, controlled. It was the kind of message someone sent when they weren't finished. At the back of the trailer, Nate stood up quietly. He didn't say a word. Just offered a respectful nod to Patrick Rowe, the only engineer who dared meet his eyes during the confrontation, then pushed open the creaky metal door. It squealed loudly against the silence inside. Outside, the ground crunched beneath Nate's steel-toed boots. His steps weren't rushed. They were slow, steady, and deliberate, like someone walking toward an appointment he had long prepared for. A few crew members outside glanced his way. One of them, a younger black welder named Tyrell, stood up straighter. He'd seen what happened in that trailer. And he had a feeling something was coming. Meanwhile, inside the operations trailer, Ryland leaned back in a folding chair and chuckled like a man who had just delivered the final word in a debate. He turned to Leo and smirked. You see that? These guys think knowing how to pour concrete makes them an engineer. Leo forced a polite smile, but his eyes flickered with doubt. Something didn't feel right. Nate's silence hadn't been defeated, had been measured. 10 minutes passed. Then Ryland's phone buzzed. He picked it up without looking, expecting maybe a call from a supplier or a county permitting officer. But instead, his eyes locked on a message that made his fingers freeze midair. Urgent, Chairman Nathaniel C. Brooks to arrive on site for unscheduled inspection. All senior staff to report to admin trailer in 15 minutes. Executive office. Ryland's grin vanished like spilled oil vanishing into sand. His lips parted, but no words came out. Nathaniel C. Brooks. That name wasn't tossed around lightly inside Ironcrest Infrastructure Group. It was sacred. Mysterious. The elusive founder and chairman of the company, rarely seen at project sites, and never without warning. He hadn't done a direct site inspection in nearly 5 years. The last time Brooks appeared on site in person, it ended with a project lead being fired on the spot for fudging concrete test data. Ryland blinked at the screen. Beads of sweat started forming at his temple, not from the heat, but from the sudden collapse of everything he thought he controlled. He slowly looked up and met Leo's eyes. "Leo," he said quietly, his voice trembling for the first time all day. "Clean up the documents. Recheck every drawing. I want the blueprints reorganized. Scrub the meeting area. Everything has to be perfect." Leo didn't move. "Wait," he said cautiously. "The chairman's really coming here." Ryland just held up the phone. That was enough. Within seconds, the administrative trailer turned from a dull afternoon lull into frantic chaos. Engineers scrambled to clear surfaces. Interns wiped off coffee stains from the desk corners. Someone even started replacing all the pen cartridges at the sign-in table. It was theater now. A desperate scramble to erase any trace of disorder. But outside, in the crew parking area far behind the site trailers, Nate Brooks was calmly unlocking the trunk of a faded silver Toyota Camry. A model so nondescript, it practically disappeared among the dust-covered trucks and crew vans. He lifted the trunk lid. Inside was a clean, pressed white shirt. A slim leather briefcase. A folded navy blazer wrapped in a dry-cleaning cover. And a black velvet box containing thin, silver-rimmed eyeglasses. He removed his work coveralls, revealing dark slacks and a crisp undershirt beneath. With unhurried precision, he buttoned the shirt, adjusted the cuffs, slipped on the blazer, and fastened a silver watch onto his wrist. Finally, he looked into the Camry's rearview mirror. Gone was the image of the exhausted, dust-covered site worker. Staring back now was a composed man with steel in his eyes and leadership in his posture. Not Nate Brooks, the foreman. Nathaniel C. Brooks, founder and chairman of Ironcrest Infrastructure Group. Exactly 14 minutes later, a sleek black Lincoln Navigator pulled up quietly to the front gate of the construction site. No escort. No company banner. Just silent authority on 4 wheels. Ryland stood just outside the administrative trailer, tie knotted, clipboard in hand, and a fixed, professional smile plastered across his face. He'd spent the last 10 minutes rehearsing a pitch in his head. The Navigator stopped. A tall white man in a black suit stepped out of the driver's seat, clearly security. Then the rear door opened. The man who stepped out was not what Ryland expected. It was Nate. No. Not Nate. It was Chairman Nathaniel C. Brooks, clad in a sharp navy suit, his glasses glinting under the Texas sun, and an aura so commanding it seemed to bend the temperature around him. Ryland froze. His throat caught. He managed to stammer out, I thought, we were expecting Mr. Brooks." Nate extended a hand. "Nathaniel C. Brooks. It's a pleasure to meet you again, Engineer Ryland." And with that, the first domino fell. Behind Ryland, the junior engineers and site managers stood dumbfounded. No one moved. No one even breathed too loudly. The man they had all watched be mocked, insulted, and dismissed just an hour ago, was now the most powerful person on the site. And he remembered everything. The scorching wind danced across the iron scaffolding, rustling blueprints pinned on outdoor boards and sending bits of gravel skittering down the slope of the construction zone. But near the gate where the black Lincoln Navigator had just arrived, time felt like it had frozen. Kenneth Ryland's hand hovered awkwardly in midair, uncertain whether to complete the handshake or step back entirely. In front of him stood a man he had just humiliated not more than an hour ago, now dressed in a fitted navy suit, polished shoes reflecting the sunlight, and a stare that was neither vengeful nor emotional. Nathaniel C. Brooks didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone filled the space more than any title or speech could. He gently lowered his outstretched hand, realizing Ryland wasn't going to take it. Then, with calm finality, he reached into his blazer pocket and handed over a sleek business card. Nathaniel C. Brooks, founder and chairman, Ironcrest Infrastructure Group. The card shimmered slightly in the light, its edges embossed, the title unmistakable. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric. Charged with shock, dread, and a creeping recognition that everything was about to change. A few feet behind Ryland, Leo Benton the assistant stood pale as drywall dust. He stared at the card, then back at Nate's face. The man they had all called Nate the cement guy had just pulled off a reveal so quietly devastating, it made every word Ryland had spoken earlier echo back with shame. Kenneth's lips parted as if to speak, but Nate cut in smoothly. "If you're wondering why you weren't informed earlier, it's simple," he said. "I didn't want to inspect blueprints. I wanted to inspect behavior." Ryland's eyebrows twitched. He stumbled back a half step, bumping into the folding chair behind him. By now, a few nearby crew members still in their dusty orange vests had gathered near the admin trailer, drawn by the sudden appearance of a high-end vehicle and the aura of something big unfolding. They couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was unmistakable. Power had shifted. "Mr. Brooks, if I had known." Nate's eyes locked onto his. "That's the point, Mr. Ryland. You didn't know. And because you didn't know, you felt safe saying what you really think." Every word dropped like a sledgehammer, measured, deliberate, undeniable. Behind Ryland, engineers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some began to inch toward the trailer, unsure if they should stay or leave. Patrick Rowe, the senior engineer who had remained silent during the earlier insult, now stood up a little straighter. His face was unreadable, but his eyes reflected a flicker of understanding. Leo stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, should we prepare the main conference room?" Nate turned to him and gave a curt nod. 15 minutes. I want every member of the technical team inside the main trailer. Bring foundation analysis records, material change logs, and site reports for the past 3 months. Ryland paled. That command struck deeper than anything yet. Not a reprimand. Not a public lashing. A meeting. A calm, precise autopsy of everything he had tried to cover. As Nate walked past Ryland toward the admin building, there was no swagger, no theatrical gloating. Just control. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice. The kind that's most terrifying when it says nothing at all. Inside the trailer, the air was thick. The walls, lined with rolled-up blueprints and pinned inspection charts, suddenly felt like the walls of a courtroom. Engineers filed in, quietly but anxiously. They took their seats around the long table where Ryland had given dozens of briefings before. Now he stood at the side like a man awaiting sentencing. Nate didn't sit. He walked to the projector, placed his tablet on the table, connected it, and loaded a single document, the foundation design for the northeast corner of the overpass. No fanfare. No slideshow. Just one blueprint. He turned to face the room. "This morning," he began, "I was told I wasn't paid to think. That my input as a field worker wasn't necessary. I was mocked for identifying structural inconsistencies in the foundation." A few engineers lowered their eyes. "And yet," Nate continued, circling a point on the diagram, "the slope here, at subzone E7, is misaligned with the rebar grid. The load stress hasn't been corrected for a 5-degree terrain tilt. If you measure lateral shift using standard footing pressure calculations." He tapped the screen again. A red indicator blinked. "You'll find cracks already forming along the outer edge. First stage stress failure. Gasps. One audible breath from someone in the corner. Patrick Rowe stepped forward. I saw a hairline crack yesterday at Station 74, he admitted. Didn't think much of it. But, this makes sense. Nate didn't react to the admission. He didn't need to. The room already knew the truth. Then, slowly, he turned to Kenneth Ryland. I'm not concerned about the insult, Nate said, voice steady. I've lived through worse. I'm concerned about what it revealed. That you don't just dismiss people. You dismiss warnings. You dismiss integrity. A murmur swept through the room. Ryland's face had gone from red to pale in the span of 5 minutes. He opened his mouth but Nate raised a hand. Not yet. I'll give you a chance to explain later. But for now, the facts speak louder. And then, with a single finger tap, Nate played a recording. From the room speakers came Ryland's voice from earlier that morning, perfectly clear, echoing through the room. We don't pay construction workers to think. Just to follow orders. The trailer went still. You could hear the hum of the projector fan. The distant sound of a concrete saw outside. Nothing else. Nate stopped the recording. He didn't have to say another word. The verdict had already begun forming not from him, but from every person in the room who had once nodded to Ryland's jokes, laughed out of self-preservation, or simply stayed silent. Now they saw who had been at the bottom. And now, they saw who stood at the top. The room was silent but not the kind of silence that meant respect. It was the kind of silence that carried weight. That pressed down on shoulders. That exposed more than words ever could. The kind of silence that lingers when power finally shifts. Nathaniel C. Brooks stood at the head of the room, calm and composed. His presence had taken full control not by force, not by volume but by absolute clarity. At the side of the room, Kenneth Ryland sat with his arms tight across his chest, his spine rigid, and his eyes darting between the engineers seated before him. Just minutes ago, this room had been his theater. His domain. Now, it was something else entirely. A tribunal. Let's move on, Nate said evenly. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a worn blueprint, one that looked far older than the digital files projected on the screen. The edges were faded, creased, and marked with red pencil strokes. He laid it gently on the table like a relic of war. This, he said, was the original foundation layout for the northeast quadrant. It was reviewed. Approved. Stamped. But it was never adjusted for field conditions. He turned to the room. Why? No one answered. Until Patrick Rowe stepped forward. The seasoned structural engineer looked at the blueprint, then at Ryland. I flagged it. In a note to Kenneth, weeks ago. I recommended a field reassessment after heavy rainfall. But the suggestion was dismissed. Nate looked to Ryland, eyebrows slightly raised. Ryland exhaled heavily. We were behind schedule. The rain already delayed slab pours. If we stopped for every suggestion from the field crew. From the field crew, Nate repeated. His voice wasn't loud. But it cut deep. That's what this is about, isn't it? Not the slope. Not the schedule. But ego. The belief that expertise only flows in one direction. A low rustling moved through the room. Some engineers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Then, as if orchestrated, the conference room door opened and 2 new figures walked in. One was Samuel Drake, Arncrest's veteran site supervisor, known for his blunt demeanor and unmatched knowledge of ground-level operations. The other wore a formal badge. Internal Audit Division. The air dropped 10 degrees. Drake walked up to Nate and handed over a thick binder. Full audit log, he said. You asked for 3 months. We went back 6. Nate accepted it without a word, then turned back to the group. He placed the binder on the table with a weighty thud. "Here's what we found," he said. 17 separate technical violations. 4 falsified inspection reports. 3 undocumented material substitutions. 2 deleted incident reports from the Foundation crack logs. A wave of disbelief rippled through the room. One junior engineer's hand shot up to cover his mouth. "That can't be right," someone murmured. Nate opened the binder. "This is a compression strength report for the Northeast slab. Dated last month. On record, it shows normal tolerances. But..." He flipped the page. "This is the raw data from the original test. The numbers were altered before submission. Lowered. Forged." He turned his eyes to Ryland. "And your digital signature approved every single one." Ryland's face drained of color. He looked at the pages like they were in another language. "I didn't." "You did," Nate said, with finality. "Whether directly or through negligence. The cracks in the concrete aren't the only cracks that matter anymore." At that moment, another engineer stood. Aaron Langley, supervisor of Foundation inspection. His voice was quiet but resolute. "I tried to warn him. When I saw misalignment on the core drill test, I emailed Kenneth. He told me not to send it to the main office. Said we'd deal with it internally." Next to him, Derek Owens, materials testing manager, nodded. "I filed a report on the change from C-grade steel to C-. Same story. I checked the dashboard later. The report was gone. The silence wasn't silence anymore. It was testimony." Nate walked slowly to the end of the table, then looked at Ryland not with anger, but something far more dangerous, disappointment. "This morning, you said that we don't pay construction workers to think," Nate said quietly. "But if you had listened, even once, we wouldn't be here." Ryland's mouth opened, but the words stuck. His body language changed. The straight-backed confidence had collapsed. His shoulders slumped slightly. He gripped the edge of the table not as a leader, but as a man trying not to fall. Nate turned to the auditors. "Next steps." One of the auditors, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor, stepped forward. "We've initiated a full procedural review. The evidence is conclusive. The violations span technical, ethical, and legal boundaries." She paused. "Per company bylaws, we're recommending immediate removal of the responsible party and potential referral for civil liability review." Everyone looked at Ryland. But Nate didn't. He looked at everyone else. "Let me be clear," he said. "This isn't about one man. This is about what happens when a culture goes unchecked. When people in power stop listening and those underneath are taught to stay silent." He walked back to the head of the room. "We build structures," he said. "But we also build systems. If either one has a weak foundation, the whole thing comes down." He looked to Ryland one last time. "And yours," he said, voice low, "just cracked wide open." The meeting room inside the Ironcrest admin trailer felt like it had no oxygen left. The blinds rattled slightly in the hot wind outside, but inside, not even the air conditioning could cool the heat of what had just been said. Kenneth Ryland sat like a man halfway buried, collar loosened, tie crooked, sweat forming under his arms despite the vents humming above him. The binder of damning evidence lay just inches from his hand, but he didn't reach for it. He couldn't. All the faces he had once dominated, interns, engineers, assistants, foremen, were now staring at him with a kind of quiet devastation. Not triumph. Not even anger. Disbelief. Disappointment. Across the table, Nathaniel C. Brooks remained standing. He had not raised his voice once, but every word he had spoken carried the weight of poured concrete. "Mr. Ryland," Nate said, his tone level but stripped of the professional cordiality it once held, "you told me without knowing who I was that construction workers aren't paid to think." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like exposed steel. "What you really meant was, people without titles aren't worth listening to. Ryland opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Until finally, voice cracking, he muttered. I didn't think it would go this far. Nate's eyebrows lifted slightly. Go how far? Ryland looked down. We cut a few inspections to save time. We used alternate steel grades because the supplier gave us a deal. We skipped microstructure analysis because we needed to hit the quarterly bonus target. Silence. Then a whisper of a question, from Patrick Rowe, the bonus? Ryland nodded slowly. His voice dropped. If we exceeded the project savings benchmark, each person in management would get a cut. $25,000 each. He swallowed hard. His face now flushed with something that looked like shame. I told myself it wasn't that serious. That if we just pushed forward, it'd be fine. You were wrong, said Aaron Langley, standing stiff across the room. His voice was quiet, but his eyes were fierce. You bet on the building holding up not with physics, but with denial. Another engineer, Derek Owens, flipped his notepad shut and leaned forward. And you altered my report. My name was on that. The weight in the room shifted again. No one was yelling. No one needed to. It was the stillness that hurt most. Ryland turned to Nate, eyes desperate. Look, I know what I did. But, isn't there any way to fix this? Nate tilted his head, just slightly. Then he turned and walked toward the wall, where the morning's foundation diagram still hung. I believe in second chances, Nate said. But not everyone deserves the same kind. He turned back to Ryland and placed a folder on the table. There are two options here. Now the entire room was locked in. Option 1, immediate termination. We press civil charges. Your license gets revoked. Your career, as you know it, ends here. A few audible gasps broke the tension. Ryland's face turned ghostly white. Option 2, Nate continued, is what I call structured restitution. He opened the folder. Inside were two documents. You resign. You return your full bonus. And for the next 6 months, you will volunteer without pay as a technical instructor at Ironcrest's community training program in South Houston. Teaching under-resourced youth, and retraining dismissed workers from sites affected by technical oversights. Ryland blinked. You want me to teach? You won't lead. You'll instruct. You'll rebuild the very thing you broke trust. He looked down at the 2 pages. 1 termination letter. 1 resignation and community service agreement. You have 5 minutes, Nate said, and stepped back. For the first time in his life, Kenneth Ryland had no idea which signature would cost him more, the one that erased his job, or the one that required him to finally listen to the people he'd ignored for so long. No one in the room moved. The clock ticked louder than before. Somewhere outside, a jackhammer fired up again, reminding them the site was still alive, still under construction just like the people inside it. Ryland's hands shook slightly as he reached for a pen. He picked up the second document. The one marked Voluntary Resignation and Training Agreement. He signed it. And just like that, the man who had ruled the site like a throne, bowed to something higher than pride. Accountability. Nate didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply closed the folder. Thank you for not running. That's a start. And then he turned toward the engineers, the supervisors, and even the interns. In 10 minutes, he announced, I'll be addressing every single worker outside. It's time this site knows the truth. And what comes next? He didn't look back as he left. Behind him, Ryland sat hunched, the paper he had just signed like a weight pressing into his lap. And on every face in that room was the same question. How many others had stayed quiet, thinking nothing could ever change, until now? The mid-afternoon sun bore down on the Ironcrest job site like a hammer made of heat. Concrete dust shimmered in the air. Hammers clinked, drills buzzed, but slowly like a ripple moving through steel beams one by one, those sounds began to quiet. From every corner of the site, laborers paused mid-task. Welders lifted their masks. Logistics teams stopped pushing carts. Someone shut down the crane's engine with a hesitant flick. There hadn't been an official announcement over the PA, but word had already spread faster than steel through rebar. The chairman is here. Near the heart of the site, workers began to gather in the large open concrete lot, half shaded by an overhead support structure still under assembly. They came not because they were forced, but because the air carried the unmistakable scent of something historic, something long overdue. At the edge of the crowd, some still whispered among themselves. "Wait, that's Nate." "No, not Nate. Nathaniel Brooks. He's been the chairman this whole time." "You're kidding." "That's who," Ryland shouted at in the trailer. Up ahead, a pair of steel scaffolding frames had been stacked into a makeshift stage. It wasn't pretty, just two connected platforms stabilized with sandbags, but it was enough to stand on. Enough to be heard. And that's exactly where Nathaniel C. Brooks now stood. He wasn't flanked by PR teams or board members. No microphone, no teleprompter. Just a man in a navy blue suit standing before the men and women who carried the true weight of every project. His eyes scanned the crowd. Rosa from Materials, the woman Ryland had once berated for speaking too emotionally. Tyrell, the machinist with scarred hands who had once dared to suggest a valve recalibration and was ignored. Luis, a young mason with calloused palms who had watched cracks form in silence for fear of being mocked. Nate cleared his throat. The yard fell completely silent. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice firm, but warm. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nathaniel Brooks. I'm the founder and chairman of Ironcrest Infrastructure Group." Several jaws dropped. "For the past 4 weeks," he continued, "I've worked here under the name, Nate, without revealing my position, without a badge, and without privilege." He paused. "I wasn't doing it to spy. I wasn't testing loyalty. I was listening." The crowd stood still. Someone shifted their hard hat nervously. Another leaned forward, needing every word. "I listened to your concerns. I saw who was respected. And I saw who was silenced." Nate stepped closer to the edge of the platform. "Today, I made a decision that will change this project permanently. Effective immediately, Kenneth Ryland is no longer with Ironcrest due to serious technical and ethical violations." The crowd didn't cheer. No one clapped. They simply listened because what they were witnessing wasn't a performance. "It was truth, but this is not just about one man," Nate said. "It's about a culture. About a system that taught some people to stay quiet and others to believe they were beyond question." His gaze swept the lot again. "That ends today." From behind the crowd, movement. Heads turned. Kenneth Ryland, in his wrinkled white shirt, walked slowly across the far end of the yard. He carried a small cardboard box, his personal items, a mug, a few folders, a framed certificate. People parted as he walked. But no one sneered. No one jeered. They just watched with a quiet that hurt worse than judgment. As Ryland passed, Nate didn't look at him with scorn. He simply nodded, a gesture of finality, of acceptance. Not forgiveness, but something gentler than punishment. Ryland disappeared behind the temporary gate that led to the parking area. And then Nate spoke again. "Starting next week," he said, "Ironcrest will launch the Voices from the Ground initiative." He explained the program. Every worker, regardless of title, could submit safety concerns or technical feedback directly to the Executive Safety Board. No filtering. No retaliation. Submissions would be reviewed within 48 hours. If a submission led to a verifiable design improvement, the worker would receive a bonus equal to that of the engineering contributor. A few people blinked. One man whispered, "Wait, what? Same bonus?" "You heard me right," Nate said. Because insight doesn't come from a diploma, it comes from paying attention. And sometimes, those who work closest to the concrete are the ones who know where the cracks really begin. A faint breeze stirred. For the first time in hours, it felt like the wind carried hope. Nate's voice softened. I know some of you have felt overlooked. Others, dismissed. I've stood next to you. Poured mortar beside you. Sat through heat breaks with you. And I'm here to tell you, I saw the truth. He looked directly at Tyrell, the machinist. When you speak up, you deserve to be heard. He turned toward Rosa. When you raise concerns, no one should interrupt you. He pointed toward Luis, and when you see a crack forming in the ground, you should never be made to believe your silence keeps things running. That lie ends now. A slow wave of applause began, tentative at first. Then stronger. Then it became a rumble. Then a roar. But it wasn't a cheer for Nate. It was a cheer for themselves. For being seen. For being respected. For being told, you matter. Nate raised his hand to quiet them once more. We're not just building roads and bridges here, he said. We're building a new foundation inside Ironcrest. And I promise you, it will be one built on humility, listening, and trust. He stepped down from the platform. And as the crowd parted to let him walk through, no one reached out to shake his hand. Instead, they nodded. Because for the first time, they weren't acknowledging a chairman. They were acknowledging a leader. The air was colder now. 6 months had passed since that blistering day on the Ironcrest site in Houston. 6 months since a chairman in a dusty uniform stepped onto a scaffolding stage and turned a construction yard into a courtroom for justice. Now, winter wind threaded through the cracked siding of a small training facility on the outskirts of South Houston. The Ironcrest Community Technical Center, once an underfunded side project with peeling paint and flickering lights, had transformed into something alive. Inside, chalk squeaked across a blackboard in classroom 4B, where a dozen students leaned over their desks, scribbling notes with the kind of focus that didn't come from rules but from respect. At the front of the room stood Kenneth Ryland. Not the Kenneth from the site meetings. Not the man in a crisp shirt barking orders behind blueprints. He wore a faded button-down, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and khaki work pants dusted from the morning's lab. His once polished posture had softened. Not slouched but grounded. In one hand, he held a wooden ruler, pointing to a chalk diagram of foundation pressure distribution on a sloped terrain. Now, he said, his voice calm, almost thoughtful, when dealing with clay-heavy soils, especially after rainfall, you have to compensate for lateral stress, or the base will shift, regardless of your reinforcement grade. A girl in the front row raised her hand, young, with dark curly hair, her fingers still smudged with graphite from drafting exercises. Mr. Ryland, she asked, how do you know if the shift will happen? What if your calculations say one thing but the ground feels different? Ryland looked at her, really looked at her. Then he stepped closer and smiled, not with superiority, but with something else. Something humble. You trust the math, he said, but you also learn to trust the feeling in your boots when you stand on the slab. The class chuckled softly. It wasn't the answer of a man trying to sound smart. It was the answer of someone who had once refused to listen and paid the price for it. After class, the students filed out slowly, a few thanking him. One stayed behind, a boy named Terrence, who had struggled through every compression lab but never gave up. Mr. Ryland, he said, voice quiet, you're different from the instructors we had last year. They mostly told us what to memorize. Ryland gave a slight shrug, picking up a clipboard. Maybe because I know what it feels like to forget what matters. As Terrence left, the door opened. In stepped Nathaniel C. Brooks, his coat still dusted from a morning site tour, scarf loose at the neck. Behind him was Patrick Rowe, carrying a new stack of training materials. Ryland looked up and froze for a second, not out of fear, but out of something that now felt like accountability. Nate stepped forward. You've stayed 6 months, he said, glancing around the clean but humble classroom. Longer than required. Ryland nodded, setting the clipboard down. I thought I'd be gone the day the term ended. But. He hesitated. They're starting to get it. They listen. They ask questions. And I don't want to leave yet. Patrick smiled. That girl Myra, he said, she just submitted a foundation analysis proposal better than most interns at HQ. Ryland lit up slightly. She's sharp. She's the first one to challenge me mid-lesson and prove me wrong twice. Nate raised an eyebrow. And how'd that feel? Ryland didn't answer right away. Then, with the faintest smirk. Better than I expected. I used to hate being corrected. Now I kind of need it. He walked to the back of the room, opening a file cabinet filled with student reports. Each labeled, color-coded, and dated. You know, Ryland said over his shoulder, for 20 years, I climbed my way up a tower built from performance metrics and quarterly bonuses. But it only took one meeting, one moment for it all to crack. He closed the drawer and turned. I don't want to climb again. I want to build. From the ground up. With people who care. Nate said nothing. He didn't need to. The message had been received. Before they left, the curly-haired student Myra returned to the doorway. Mr. Ryland, she asked gently, can I ask you something? He nodded. Did anyone ever give you a second chance before this? Ryland paused. His hands slipped into his pockets. No, he said, eyes meeting hers. No one did. I had to take it for myself. But then, someone believed I could actually do something with it. Myra nodded slowly, and left. After she was gone, Nate looked at Patrick. You think he's ready? Patrick watched Ryland tidying up the desks, aligning rulers, checking student notebooks. He's not who he was. That guy is gone. This one might actually change lives. Nate nodded and looked through the glass window at the overpass in the distance where Ryland's foundation once cracked. It still stood. Reinforced now. Retested. Safe. But the more important rebuild was happening here. In this classroom. In a man who once couldn't see beyond his own status, now building foundations out of humility. The wind outside the Ironcrest Technical Training Center howled low across the cold suburban fields. Inside, a heater hummed, bouncing warmth off concrete walls and desk surfaces still marked with graphite lines and traceable blueprints. It was the kind of place that didn't pretend to be grand, but for Kenneth Ryland, it had become sacred ground. This was where he had learned how to build again. Not buildings. People. And somewhere along the way, himself. 6 months had passed since Kenneth chose restitution over ruin. 6 months of volunteer instruction. No paycheck. No title. No recognition. And then one Monday morning, he arrived early to find a note slipped under his office door. To Mr. Ryland, we are pleased to offer you a permanent position as a senior instructor at Ironcrest's Foundation Forward program. Your work has transformed not just students, but our entire training model. Respectfully, N. Brooks. He stared at the paper for a long time. Not because he didn't believe it. But because, for the first time in his life, he didn't need it to know he was worth something. He folded the letter gently and slipped it into a folder not under Career, but under a new tab he had created weeks earlier, Purpose. That afternoon, as he packed up lesson plans, he received a call. 3 offers. A project coordinator role in Austin with a top-tier firm. A technical director position in Denver. A team lead opportunity in Zurich with full relocation and 6-figure compensation. He didn't take any of them. Instead, he walked down the hallway to classroom 4B, where Myra was reviewing slump test data and Terrence was leading a mock inspection drill. He pulled a stool beside Myra. Hey, he said softly, tapping her diagram. You forgot lateral bar placement under section 3. Want to walk me through the logic again? She looked up, grinned sheepishly, and began explaining. That was his decision made. He didn't want a title. He wanted this. 2 weeks later, Ironcrest headquarters. On the 30th floor of Ironcrest's glass-paneled skyscraper downtown, Nathaniel C. Brooks stood before a room filled with engineers, executives, field managers, and auditors. Behind him was a large screen not showing charts or forecasts, but a photo. A young man in a dusty vest, pointing at a blueprint. Next to him stood a junior engineer, listening intently. At the bottom of the photo. Knowing less doesn't mean not knowing what's right. Nate turned to face the crowd. 6 months ago, we were building structures with cracks, some physical, some ethical. But we're not here to talk about failure. We're here to talk about what we did next. He paced slowly. We launched the Voices from the Ground initiative. And since then, we've logged over 220 worker-submitted improvement ideas. 46 of those have already been implemented into active designs. He tapped the remote again. A chart appeared, 78% increase in safety compliance. 0 ignored structural warnings. 0 unreported field concerns. The room nodded, murmuring with cautious pride. Then Nate said something unexpected. We're not done. He waved to the back of the room. And in walked Kenneth Ryland, wearing his simple gray shirt, no suit, no tie. Just a clipboard and a name tag. Kenneth Ryland, Field Technical Instructor. Some heads turned. Others stiffened. But most just watched. Nate gestured for him to join. This man made mistakes. Serious ones. But he also chose something very few people with his background ever do. He stayed. He changed. Nate turned back to the room. And starting today, he'll serve as lead instructor for the second wave of our mentorship program, training not just apprentices, but our own technical managers, engineers, and supervisors. A pause. Then, slowly, a round of applause. Not everyone clapped, but enough to matter. Later that week, the lobby. Downstairs, in the Ironcrest Tower lobby, Kenneth stood next to a group of new interns. He held up a small pebble, gray, jagged, ordinary. This isn't on the blueprint, he said. But if you ignore it, it can misalign the whole slab. That's what I used to do, ignore the little things. The voices. The hands in the field. He paused, not anymore. A girl raised her hand. Mr. Ryland, what should we do if one day we face someone powerful, but we know they're wrong? Kenneth looked at her. Then he smiled genuinely, without restraint. Speak up. Kindly. Firmly. But speak. Because silence doesn't keep a building upright. It just hides the cracks until everything falls. From his office upstairs, Nate Brooks stood quietly, watching through the thick glass window as Kenneth led the next generation. He rested his hand on a stainless steel plaque recently installed on the wall beside the community board. The strongest structure isn't built with steel. It's built with respect. No signature. No plaque of ego. Just principle. Because the point wasn't to leave your name behind. The point was to leave something better standing than what was here before. A fine layer of winter fog clung to the windows of Ironcrest Tower, softening the skyline of Houston's bustling downtown below. But inside, clarity was sharper than ever. It had been nearly a year since Nathaniel C. Brooks, under the guise of a field worker named Nate, had quietly stepped into the trenches of his own company to witness what titles and reports could never show, the truth about culture, respect, and the dangers of unchecked power. And now, the consequences of that choice had rippled far beyond one construction site, one scandal, or one disgraced engineer. It had become a blueprint for transformation. Inside the company's newly repurposed 30th floor community mentorship room, a space once reserved for board-only meetings, now sat a diverse panel of voices: field workers, site supervisors, junior engineers, safety officers, and administrative staff. The room buzzed not with hierarchy but with ideas. At the center of the table was a placard that read, Mentorship from the Ground, Session 5, Policy Review and Field Feedback Integration. And at the head of the table? Not a VP. Not even Nate. It was Kenneth Ryland. No longer a man seeking redemption. He had found it. Now, he led with the calm of someone who had walked through the storm and survived. Our topic today, Kenneth began, adjusting his reading glasses, is reactive load tolerances on subgrade platforms. But first I want to hear from someone who's worked hands-on with those issues in the field. He looked up. Tyrell, the machinist from the old job site, now promoted to assistant supervisor at a satellite project, raised his hand. So did Luis, the young mason who once stayed silent while watching the ground sink beneath his boots. Kenneth pointed to Luis, "You first." No one blinked. No one questioned why a mason's opinion mattered at a policy table. Because now, it did. A company transformed. Across Ironcrest's multiple project sites, things looked different. Suggestion boxes, physical and digital, were checked daily by a cross-department response team. All staff, regardless of position, were now required to undergo leadership from below, workshops taught, in part, by Kenneth and rotating field experts. Bonuses were no longer tied to just cost savings, but to safe innovation, collaborative success, and field-verified improvements. And perhaps most radically, every safety and design meeting now began with 5 minutes reserved for field worker input mandatory. The change didn't happen overnight. But it held. Because it had been built not from a policy memo but from a moment of reckoning. Recognition beyond the walls. It wasn't long before Ironcrest's story began catching attention outside its own ecosystem. First came the industry magazines, then inquiries from engineering ethics associations, and eventually a call from the National Construction Safety Council inviting Nathaniel Brooks to speak. He declined at first. Then, at the insistence of his team, he agreed on one condition. Kenneth Ryland would speak first. That winter, under a stage light at the National Engineering Convention in D.C., Kenneth stood before 2,000 industry professionals. Behind him, the screen showed an image of a cracked slab, and beside it, a photo of Classroom 4B from South Houston. His opening words were simple. "I was once the kind of engineer who thought knowledge was a shield. That a degree meant I didn't need to listen. But when the building started to crack, it wasn't my knowledge that saved it. It was a man I didn't respect who spoke up anyway." The audience didn't applaud at first. They sat in stunned silence. Then the hands came together. Slowly. Then louder. And then standing. At the edge of a foundation pour. Back in Houston, under a blue Texas sky, a new Ironcrest tower began to rise. On the south end of the site, a ceremony was being held not for groundbreaking, but for something more symbolic. The first pour of the foundation. As cement churned in the trucks, Nate stood beside Kenneth, both wearing hard hats and safety vests. Kenneth looked out at the new interns, dozens of them, some fresh from high school, others retrained after layoffs, a few returning citizens seeking a second chance. He leaned over and said to Nate, "You remember when I told you I didn't even know the names of the people beneath me?" Nate nodded. Kenneth smiled. "Now I count every one of them." Nate clapped a hand on his shoulder. "That's how you know the rebuild is real." Together, they watched as the concrete began to pour, thick, heavy, honest. It didn't hide the labor beneath. It honored it. In the lobby, a new monument. Back inside Ironcrest Tower, something new had been installed in the central lobby. Not a plaque. Not a statue. A simple quote, etched into the glass wall beside the elevators: "We rise by how we listen. We endure by how we rebuild." Voices from the Ground Initiative, 2025. No CEO's name. No architect's stamp. Just a truth. One built on the mistakes of the past. And the courage to fix them. The wind had quieted now. Not the silence of pause but of peace. 1 year to the day since the confrontation in the construction trailer, Ironcrest Infrastructure Group stood as a different company. Not just with safer sites or better audit scores but with something much harder to measure. Trust. And it was not built by policy alone. It was built brick by brick, on every conversation once ignored, every suggestion once dismissed, and every person once unseen. At the Woodrow Technical Training Center, the final class of the winter term gathered in classroom 4B. A group of students once anxious, overlooked, uncertain now ran simulations, completed certifications, and worked in teams like engineers in the field. At the front of the room, Kenneth Ryland closed the lesson book. It was his last official day as a volunteer instructor. But unlike the man who had first entered this classroom 6 months ago with his head bowed by shame, today he stood tall. Not proud. Grateful. He collected the project models, signed off final scores, then turned to face the class. "I want to leave you with something I didn't have for too long in my career," he said. "A question." He picked up a small brick from the lab table, a practice model the students had used for foundation stress testing. "This is a piece of a mock slab. It's not heavy. It's not expensive. It's not even perfect." He held it up. "But if it's placed wrong, even this small, everything above it can fail." Then he looked around the room. "In your work, you'll be asked to stay quiet. To avoid confrontation. To accept what you're told because someone has a fancier title or a cleaner shirt." A long pause. "Don't." He gently set the brick down. "Speak. Think. Share. Ask. Because what you don't say today might be the crack you'll see tomorrow." One student raised their hand, Myra, now the top of her class. "What do we do," she asked, "if we are the one who messes up? Not because we didn't know, but because we didn't listen." Kenneth nodded. "Then you do what I had to do. You take responsibility. Not just in words. In actions. You stay. You fix it. You help others avoid the same." Another student leaned forward. "And if no one gives you a second chance?" This time, Kenneth's voice softened. "Then take it for yourself. And become the kind of person who gives it to someone else." At the top of Ironcrest Tower, in a room once dominated by executive chatter, now filled with worker-led review panels, mentorship meetings, and design ethics sessions, Nathaniel C. Brooks stood alone. In front of him, the first blueprint ever submitted under the Voices from the Ground initiative hung in a frame. Not perfectly drawn. Not digital. Not impressive to the untrained eye. It had been submitted by a 19-year-old intern, one of Kenneth's students. Her note scrawled across the top read, "I know I'm just learning, but I think this slope changes the load." It was correct. The revision had saved the project $380,000 and prevented a potential crack. Nate smiled. Then he stepped toward the large glass window, hands behind his back, and stared at the tower next door, a structure Ironcrest had once dreamed of but now embodied. A tower whose walls shimmered with steel and glass, but whose strongest part was what lay beneath. The invisible foundation poured from integrity, humility, and the courage to rebuild not just concrete, but people. Weeks later, Kenneth sat with Nate in a modest meeting room in the training center. No audience. No cameras. Just 2 chairs and a coffee thermos. "You know," Kenneth said, cradling a mug, "I was offered a consulting job in Boston. Big salary. No teaching. Just reviewing structures all day." "And?" Nate asked, smiling without pressure. Kenneth shook his head. "I turned it down. Told them I had something better." Nate leaned back. "What was that?" Kenneth looked at him. "A life that doesn't need to be rebuilt again." This is not just Kenneth Ryland's story. It's a story about every leader who forgets what it means to listen, and every worker who was told they were too small to be heard. It's about how power, when left unchecked, breeds silence, and how silence cracks the strongest foundations. But more importantly, it's about the possibility of restoration. Because the truth is, every person will make a mistake, but not every person will have the courage to stay and fix it brick by brick, voice by voice. And every structure, every company, every team, is only as strong as its willingness to let people grow beyond their worst moment. So now we ask you, if you were in Nathaniel Brooks's position, would you have given Kenneth a second chance? Would you have stood on that site, seen past the arrogance, and chosen to rebuild him instead of burying him? Let us know in the comments below. Because somewhere, right now, someone is watching a crack form whether in concrete, or in character. And maybe they're waiting to see if someone will speak up. Maybe they're waiting for you. If this story moved you, share it. Comment below. And subscribe to our channel for more powerful real-life transformations and narratives that build from the inside out. We don't just tell stories, we pour foundations. Thank you for being here.